Chapter 26. Whenever I went out into the hall of the rooming house, Gertrude seemed to be standing there. She was perfect, pure maddening sex, and she knew it, and she played on it, dripped it, and allowed you to suffer for it. It made her happy. I didn't feel too bad either. She could easily have shut me out and not even have allowed me to be warmed by a glimpse of it. Like most men in that situation, I realized that I wouldn't get anything out of her. Intimate talks, exciting roller coaster rides, long Sunday afternoon walks, until after I had made some odd promises. "You're a strange guy. You stay alone a lot, don't you?" "Yes." "What's wrong?" "I was sick long before that morning you met me." "Are you sick now?" "No." "Then what's wrong?" "I don't like people." "Do you think that's right?" "Probably not." "Will you take me to a movie some night?" "I'll try." Gertrude swayed in front of me. She swayed on her high heels. She moved forward. Bits of her were touching me. I simply couldn't respond. There was a space between us. The distance was too great. I felt as if she was talking to a person who had vanished, a person who was no longer there, no longer alive. Her eyes seemed to look right through me. I couldn't make a connection with her. I didn't feel shame for that, only rather embarrassed and helpless. "Come with me." "What?" "I want to show you my bedroom." I followed Gertrude down the hall. She opened her bedroom door and I followed her in. It was a very feminine room. The large bed was covered with stuffed animals. All of the animals looked surprised and stared at me. Giraffes, bears, lions, dogs. The air was perfumed. Everything was neat and clean and looked soft and comfortable. Gertrude moved close to me. "You like my bedroom?" "It's nice." "Oh yes, I like it." "Don't ever tell Mrs. Downing that I asked you in here. She'd be scandalized." "I won't tell." Gertrude stood there silently. "I have to go," I told her finally. Then I went to the door, opened it, closed it behind me, and walked back to my room. Chapter 27. After losing several typewriters to pawnbrokers, I simply gave up the idea of owning one. I printed out my stories by hand and sent them out that way. I hand printed them with a pen. I got to be a very fast hand printer. It got so that I could hand print faster than I could write. I wrote 3 or 4 short stories a week. I kept things in the mail. I imagine the editors of the Atlantic Monthly and Harper's saying, "Hey, here's another one of those things by that nut." One night I took Gertrude to a bar. We sat at a table to one side and drank beer. It was snowing outside. I felt a little better than usual. We drank and talked. An hour or so passed. I began gazing into Gertrude's eyes and she looked right back. "A good man, nowadays, is hard to find," said the jukebox. Gertrude moved her body to the music, moved her head to the music, and looked into my eyes. "You have a very strange face," she said. "You're not really ugly." Number 4 shipping clerk, working his way up. "Have you ever been in love?" "Love is for real people." "You sound real." "I dislike real people." "You dislike them?" "I hate them." We drank some more, not saying much. It continued to snow. Gertrude turned her head and stared into the crowd of people. Then she looked at me. "Isn't he handsome?" "Who?" "That soldier over there. He's sitting alone. He sits so straight. And he's got all his medals on." "Come on, let's get out of here." "But it's not late." "You can stay." "No. I want to go with you." "I don't care what you do." "Is it the soldier? Are you mad because of the soldier?" "Oh shit. It was the soldier. I'm going." I stood up at the table, left a tip, and walked toward the door. I heard Gertrude behind me. I walked down the street in the snow. Soon she was walking at my side. "You didn't even get a taxi. These high heels in the snow." I didn't answer. We walked the 4 or 5 blocks to the rooming house. I went up the steps with her beside me. Then I walked down to my room, opened the door, closed it, got out of my clothes and went to bed. I heard her throw something against the wall of her room. Chapter 28. I kept handprinting my short stories. I sent most of them to Clay Gladmore, whose New York mag Front Fire I admired. They only paid $25 a story, but Gladmore had discovered William Sarowan and many others, had been Sherwood Anderson's buddy. Gladmore returned many of my things with personal rejections. True, most of them weren't very long, but they did seem kind and they were encouraging. The larger magazines used printed rejection slips. Even Gladmore's printed slips seemed to have some warmth to them. We regret, alas, that this is a rejection slip, but... So I kept Gladmore busy with 4 or 5 stories a week. Meanwhile, I was in ladies' dress wear, down in the cellar. Klein still hadn't ousted Larrabee. Cox, the other shipping clerk, didn't care who was ousted as long as he could sneak his smoke on the stairway every 25 minutes. Overtime became automatic. I drank more and more in my off hours. The 8-hour day was gone forever. In the morning when you walked in, you might as well settle for at least 11 hours. This included Saturdays, which used to be half days, but which had turned into full days. The war was on, but the ladies were buying the hell out of dresses. It was after one 12-hour day. I had gotten into my coat, had come up out of the cellar, had lighted a cigarette and was walking along the hallway toward the exit when I heard the boss's voice. "Chinaski." "Yes?" "Step in here." My boss was smoking a long, expensive cigar. He looked well rested. "This is my friend, Carson Gentry." Carson Gentry was also smoking a long, expensive cigar. "Mr. Gentry is a writer too. He is very interested in writing. I told him that you were a writer and he wanted to meet you. You don't mind, do you?" "No, I don't mind." They both sat there looking at me and smoking their cigars. Several minutes passed. They inhaled, exhaled, looked at me. "Do you mind if I leave?" I asked. "It's all right," said my boss. Chapter 29. I always walked to my room. It was 6 or 7 blocks away. The trees along the streets were all alike. Small, twisted, half-frozen, leafless. I liked them. I walked along under the cold moon. That scene in the office stayed with me. Those cigars, the fine clothes. I thought of good steaks, long rides up winding driveways that led to beautiful homes, ease, trips to Europe, fine women. Were they that much more clever than I? The only difference was money and the desire to accumulate it. I'd do it too. I'd save my pennies. I'd get an idea. I'd spring a loan. I'd hire and fire. I'd keep whiskey in my desk drawer. I'd have a wife with size 40 breasts and an ass that would make the paper boy on the corner come in his pants when he saw it wobble. I'd cheat on her and she'd know it and keep silent in order to live in my house with my wealth. I'd fire men just to see the look of dismay on their faces. I'd fire women who didn't deserve to be fired. That was all a man needed, hope. It was lack of hope that discouraged a man. I remembered my New Orleans days, living on 2 5-cent candy bars a day for weeks at a time in order to have leisure to write. But starvation, unfortunately, didn't improve art. It only hindered it. A man's soul was rooted in his stomach. A man could write much better after eating a porterhouse steak and drinking a pint of whiskey than he could ever write after eating a nickel candy bar. The myth of the starving artist was a hoax. Once you realized that everything was a hoax, you got wise and began to bleed and burn your fellow man. I'd build an empire upon the broken bodies and lives of helpless men, women, and children. I'd shove it to them all the way. I'd show them. I was at my rooming house. I walked up the stairway to the door of my room. I unlocked the door, turned on the light. Mrs. Downing had put the mail by my door. There was a large brown envelope from Gladmore. I picked it up. It was heavy with rejected manuscripts. I sat down and opened the envelope. Dear Mr. Chinaski, we are returning these 4 stories, but we are keeping My Beer-Drunk Soul is Sadder Than All the Dead Christmas Trees of the World. We have been watching your work for a long time, and we are most happy to accept this story. Sincerely, Clay Gladmore. I got up from the chair, still holding my acceptance slip. My first, from the #1 literary magazine in America. Never had the world looked so good, so full of promise. I walked over to the bed, sat down, read it again. I studied each curve in the handwriting of Gladmore's signature. I got up, walked the acceptance slip over to the dresser, propped it there. Then I undressed, turned out the lights, and went to bed. I couldn't sleep. I got up, turned on the light, walked over to the dresser, and read it again. Dear Mr. Chinaski. Chapter 30. I often saw Gertrude in the hall. We talked, but I didn't ask her out again. She stood very close to me, gently swaying, now and then staggering, as if drunk, upon her very high heels. One Sunday morning I found myself on the front lawn with Gertrude and Hilda. The girls made snowballs, laughed and screamed, threw them at me. Never having lived in snow country, I was slow at first, but I soon found out how to make a snowball and hurl it. Gertrude fired up, screamed. She was delicious. She was all flare and lightning. For a moment I felt like walking across the lawn and grabbing her. Then I gave up, walked away down the street with the snowballs whizzing past me. Tens of thousands of young men were fighting in Europe and China, in the Pacific Islands. When they came back, she'd find one. She wouldn't have any problem. Not with that body. Not with those eyes. Even Hilda wouldn't have any difficulty. I began to feel that it was time for me to leave St. Louis. I decided to go back to Los Angeles. Meanwhile, I kept hand-printing short stories by the score, got drunk, listened to Beethoven's Fifth, Brahms' Second. One particular night after work, I stopped at a local bar. I sat and drank 5 or 6 beers, got up and walked the block or so to my rooming house. Gertrude's door was open as I walked past. Henry. Hello. I walked up to the door, looked at her. Gertrude, I'm leaving town. I gave notice at work today. Oh, I'm sorry. You people have been nice to me. Listen, before you leave, I want you to meet my boyfriend. Your boyfriend? Yes, he just moved in, right down the hall. I followed her. She knocked and I stood behind her. The door opened. Gray and white striped pants, long-sleeved check shirt, necktie, a thin mustache, vacant eyes. Out of one of his nostrils seemed a nearly invisible thread of snot that had finally gathered into a little gleaming ball. The ball had settled in the mustache and was gathering to drip off, but meanwhile it sat there and reflected the light. Joey, she said, I want you to meet Henry. We shook hands. Gertrude went in. The door closed. I walked back to my room and began packing. Packing was always a good time.